country in every meeting. But the fact remains that we had more representation in this meeting in Srinagar than we've had in the previous tourism working group meetings. I think as I said, most countries were represented, and there were some very good discussions. For us, what is important is that we were able to focus on the agenda and also, I think, draw attention to one of our most important tourist locations. After all, it was a tourism working group meeting. We were also kept in mind the Prime Minister's vision to host a G20 presidency which would be dealing with healing, harmony and hope, and to work as one family to create a new paradigm of human-centric globalization. That's our endeavor.
Right. As you mentioned earlier, we're halfway through our G20 presidency. In September, you've got the major leaders meeting that will take place in New Delhi. Give us a sense of the kind of preparations, the scale of the preparations for that.
So, as you mentioned, we are halfway through our presidency. We have done about 120 meetings in 46 different cities of our country. We're very satisfied with the range and spread of our meetings. Again, this is in keeping with the Prime Minister's vision that the G20 should not be confined to the capital alone, but should be held across the length and breadth of our country so that every citizen of India becomes a stakeholder in the G20 process. As we are now coming closer to the summit, obviously preparations for the summit are getting more attention. We have the convention center that is specially earmarked for the G20, which is coming up very well. We also have some 20 different agencies of the central government and the Delhi government working on different aspects of preparation for the G20, whether it is the paving of roads or it is beautification of the city. Many functional areas which need to be kept in mind are also being addressed. So I think preparations are in full swing, and as we come closer to the summit, we'll see a lot more efforts in that direction. There's also a lot of emphasis on areas like security, medical facilities. Just the other day, we had a meeting which was convened both by the Principal Secretary to the PM on many of the issues that are there, the Coordination Committee for the G20, and also by the Home Secretary on many of these aspects. So, as I said, preparations are taking place in earnest, and we will see more of that as we come closer to the summit.
Right, we've been seeing G20 giving a big boost to tourism as well. Give us a sense, when this meeting happens in Delhi, the kind of arrangements that would be made in terms of commuting or taking the guests from one location to other, taking delegates from one location to another, the number of hotels that are likely to be booked?
Well, logistically, it is a fairly daunting, I would say, challenge to host 40+ delegations of the highest level possible. We also expect between 8,000 and 12,000 foreign visitors to come into Delhi at that time. Clearly, we will have to use as much of the hotel space that is available in the NCR region as possible. We'll also have to create corridors to enable these carcades of the heads of state and government to come into the different venues of the G20 meeting. So it needs a lot of planning, a lot of organization, and a lot of logistical calibration well in advance of the summit. But you can be sure that we are gearing up, and our different partners, I would say, parts of the government that are working on the summit are absolutely geared up for this important event.
Right. Before the G20 kicked off, you had given us a sense that India would like every G20 meeting to have a cultural event, a cultural component very typical of that particular city. When the leaders, when heads of state, prime ministers arrive in New Delhi, would this be a one-city function only, or would you like to show them another city for a cultural component?
So when it comes to the G20 summit, there is a certain precedent and pattern that is followed. Normally, this is the meetings are over a 1.5 days, so there is a limited amount of time available. You can imagine that leaders of these important countries also have a limited amount of time that they can spare for the G20 meeting. So we will confine our efforts to the capital. As I said, we've had meetings. We will have had 250 meetings or so across the length and breadth of our country. But the summit will be in the capital, and the entire gamut of activities, including a cultural program, would be in New Delhi itself.
Right. About taking forward the consensus reached at G7 to G20, a bridge from G7 to G20 and then to COP28. What are some of the deliverables that we would be hoping to achieve, which the Prime Minister is hoping to achieve?
Well, I think the discussions in the G7 were very important because G7 members are an important component of the G20, and there are a lot of similarities in the priorities that the G7 have identified and those of the G20 under our presidency. Issues like food security, issues like debt servicing and debt relief, issues that relate to priorities to the developing world, especially Africa. These are areas that are commonalities that we'll pick up on, and there's a lot more to that I think we will be in touch with our colleagues in the G7 on. I mean, there is already a fair amount of I would say exchanges between the G7 and the G20 Secretariat between the substantive tracks of both our sides, and I think we will be working to get maximum traction for all of the issues under our presidency. My
final set of questions, sir. Do we expect consensus on the definition of startups? This is something that's very close to the Prime Minister's office as well.
Yes, I think if you see the website, there is already a draft definition up. It calls for comments from member states, and I think we are well onto that exercise. Keep in mind that Startup 20 is an Indian construct. We had initiated it. This is the first time Startup 20 is meeting under our presidency, and this will continue under future presidencies of the G20. So definition is important because it not only involves industry, but it also involves research, involves a range of actors that are involved with the startup industry, startup sector. And I think we are well on our way to attaining that important objective of a definition.
Right. When it comes to Global South, how are we wanting to position ourselves as the voice of the Global South? How would you like this to be put in the communique, in the leaders' communique, which is issued after the meeting in September?
Well, we are very clear that in our presidency of the G20, we not only represent the interests of our partners and interlocutors within the G20 and NVT countries, but also the larger international community. And of them, the developing world is very important, not only because, as our External Affairs Minister has said, India is perceived to be the voice of the Global South, but also because in today's day and age, many of the concerns that are there at the global level pertain specifically or impact adversely on the Global South. Whether it is inflation, whether it is the high costs of the import of food, fuel and fertilizers, whether it is the issue of indebtedness, I think all of this are primarily concerns of the Global South. We intend to use our presidency to articulate the views and concerns of the Global South. And in that context, as you recall, a structured engagement with the Global South has been undertaken at the level of our leadership. The Prime Minister himself was part of that exercise in January this year. And that enabled us to get a fairly clear view of what the developing world expects of us under our G20 presidency. And you can be sure that we will make sure that those concerns are heard loud and clear, and those are actually articulated in the outcomes that the G20 seeks to achieve under our presidency.
Mr. Shringla, thank you so much for speaking to CNBC-TV18.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you so
Parikshit.
much, sir.
It's a
Lovely
pleasure.
talking to you.
Thank you.